Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with a television licence fee. My name is Valerie Vetter, and you're listening to Hospice Women. This documentary goes behind the scenes of St Francis Hospice Dublin for a rare and privileged insight into what it's like to work and volunteer within such a special place. St Francis Hospice has been helping the people of Dublin's North Side for over 30 years. All of its services are provided free of charge to patients and their families. About 90% of its staff and 70% of its volunteers are women. Many of them have been working within the organisation for decades. Sister Bernadette McMahon is one of St Francis Hospice's founders. She explains how it came into existence.
It's very early beginning, and this is right back prior to the hospice itself. We had a hospital out in Northbrook Road called St Anne's, and it had a great tradition right back, it's interesting, of holistic care and very person-centred care. It was right to see the person as a member of a family, holistic, with a job, family, concerns, so that was always the approach. The legacy, the values, the ethos, which we took for granted. The south side is fairly well catered for, but is there anywhere else that, we could bring, sisters who had all that skills and whatever else we had by way of resources, but very little, respond to a challenge of unmet needs. And the unmet needs, so that's what we started to explore. Was there anything else we could do? So this was in about the mid-80s. There's no hospice at all on the north side. What about exploring the possibility of a small hospice? And we began to make quite. But then also, if we're going to look at what is involved in a hospice, so in I think it was 1985, Sister Annette and Sister Dorothy went over to Manchester and London, and they visited hospices, including St Christopher, and met the famous James Cecily Saunders, and they learned a huge amount. And it was great that they had that experience because they saw the best. We had a good friend called Dr. Hugh Rafferty who worked in St Anne's, and he knew that we were exploring something, and we sat down and talked with him. And he was also on the board of the hospice, the Irish Hospice Foundation. So he went to Mary Redmond and said, and what we were doing, and he said, I think you better see the sisters. We now have the daughters, not knowing anything about the hospice, not knowing that the Irish Hospice Foundation were also had in mind a second hospice, but they didn't know where. And they were thinking broadly of the north side. So they were working independently. We were ploughing our little furrow, very small. Where would we go? But we both were thinking of the north side, where there wasn't one.
Before a building even existed, St Francis Hospice ran its very first service from a porta-cabin in the grounds of the Capuchin Friary in Raheny. It was a palliative care service for patients in their homes. Martina O'Dowd is a home care palliative nurse. She's speaking here with Betty McDonnell, who was actually St Francis Hospice's very first home care palliative nurse.
Early 1990 then I came out to St Francis, and I came originally as holiday relief.
For Betty?
Yeah, holiday, because for Betty, for the summer holidays for Paulie and Betty to go on holidays, I would be the other person, Agnes, yeah. And I suppose that turned into then from there to a job. You see, I had trained in palliative care with Betty before that, so in the Morrison, we were in the Morrison together.
And what was your typical day like?
Okay. Typical day would be, we would meet in the morning and we'd go through the patients on our list, and we'd see who needed a visit, and we would divide out the visits, allocate the visits then among ourselves, and then go out with our charts and go and see our patients.
Yeah, like we said, Martina, we did a 24-hour service.
7 days a week.
7 days a week. And therefore we initially had a big talkie-walkie phone. And we had a bleep that went off, but you had to find a phone box to ring. The number came up.
Yeah.
So this is 24 hours a day?
24 hours a day, yeah.
And did you have any idea, the next patient?
No.
All different backgrounds?
Was going off, and you responded to the calls. You'd have your set calls, and then you took everything else that came in. So it was busy. It was busy because you were on your own.
I suppose they began to look at it then. One weekend I was on, and I had actually done 14 calls in a day. And done the night, and that morning on my way to work, when the patient who was uncontrolled went on my way down a Black Horse Avenue. I remember it very clearly. You know, we just we're learning, and we're building a service, and we didn't really question it very much. We were there for the patient. At the same time, I suppose then we were just in the age of life, we're in our late 20s, and we were just married or not married, but you know, you were building a service, the name of the hospice. We did lots of fundraising, not fundraising as in thanking people for raising money. I did Live at 3 with Thelma Mansfield and Thelma Mansfield, that's her name, and Derek Davis. I did radio programmes. A few radio programmes and a drive show.
We did a lot of education.
Did people understand what hospice was? Or
not really, no. And there would have been, I suppose, it was a new service. We were very aware of our place in the community in the sense that we knew that to make it work we had to forge it ahead, and we had to be. We were always very open to you know, whatever we could do for them.
And what kind of questions would people ask you?
It was always, you know, this fear of the hospice and death, and don't tell him. And where now you'd say, well, if he asks, I'd tell. But I do remember a man asking me, and I had come like Martina from the Marsden, and it was a lot of things were more forward then, and the stigma wasn't as, and if somebody asked you about death, you did broach it with them. And we went with the patient, the families, and we still do, but we would now be more like, if he's going to ask, if he asks me, okay, I'll be very gentle and see what he knows, but I have to be honest, you know.
The whole culture has changed.
It has.
The whole face of hospice has completely changed. People are more open to it, like, you mean, even things like, you know, social media, phones, computers, people look up things now, they look up their conditions. That was all really, you know, as Betty said, like, you know, our mobile phone was like a big box that the handset set into, you know, and you know, we were just short of having to wind it up. Big, huge battery that only lasted a very short space of time. And so there was, you know, nowadays, you know, patients, that any patient we take on, that they've for good and for bad too, they've Googled their medicine, they've Googled their condition, and they come with all that information, and some of it's not helpful to them either, you know. But there's a lot more openness now and things like that. Really,
so,
I'd have to say that's a good thing.
In a pre-internet age, what are the massive changes then that you've seen in the job?
I think, to be honest with you, and Sister Dorothy always said, I think the very basis of the job is still the same. It's good symptom control, it's compassionate care, holistic care, and there's no great science to it, to be honest with you. I think it's just the same care. A lot more people now involved in the doing of it. Like, I suppose in the early days we were kind of sorting out a wheelchair for them. Like, we were doing things outside our own remit, but I mean, we were still kind of, you know, we were helping them with their walk, and we might have, you know, tried with our colleagues getting hospital beds, things. So we had an awful lot. We had an awful lot more to do. Now we have other colleagues and their expertise that help us. We were doing some of the pre-bereavement care, you know, and the counselling and...
And we were like, you know, Martina and I had done, we'd say, other courses like massage or whatever, and we were doing complementary therapies with our little bottle of oil in our bag. Whatever called at you brought to it. You know the rituals around death and dying, where now you're empowering patients and family, and that is a particular role. But Martina is right that it did bring, you know, now it has gone a bit more complex. The bases are the same, but with a lot of people having palliative chemotherapy and immunotherapy, and that has brought its own challenges to us, because we're dealing with it as a palliative point of view, but they're having immunotherapy and treatments alongside. So they're not always clear on their prognosis, and even though we can see, maybe we may think we're clear some of the time, but the prognosis can be longer because of responding to palliative treatment and that sort of thing. So then if they come up with symptoms like, you don't know if it's the treatment or the disease, so it has made it a bit more complex. But we are pure palliative care nurses, and that's part of who I am, and Martina is. I'm not talking for Martina, but like, I am a mother, a wife, a friend, a palliative care nurse. And I found a home in St Francis and a home at home. And I have 3 homes, I'd say, at this stage. You know, so it's part of who I am. And it is part of who I always will be as a palliative care nurse.
My name's Barbara Kilbride and I'm the Coordinator of Volunteer Services at St Francis Hospice Dublin.
How many volunteers does St Francis have?
At the moment we have over 308 volunteers, so that's across our 2 hospices, Raheny, Blanchardstown, and also our volunteers that help us in the community.
What are the different roles that they play?
I think on top of my head, I think there's about 48 different roles. So there's volunteer roles that you can work directly with the patients. So that would be in hospitality, serving tea and coffee to the patients, maybe just sitting and being present with them, listening to them, maybe reading to them. We also have volunteers who do hairdressing, complementary therapy, also volunteers who drive our patients into hospice daycare and drive them back home again. We also have volunteers in our gardens, and also we have volunteers in our community, and that's just a small snippet. Volunteers are an integral part of St Francis Hospice and have been since the onset. And back in the day, back in 1989 when we started, we were in a little porta cabin and we had a community palliative care team and we had volunteers, and that was
from
back,
the very beginning.
Yeah, very beginning. And the volunteers back then, Pat Breslin, she was probably answering phones, she was organising, making sure the nurses knew where to go. She was also raising money for the organisation, she was raising awareness, and now we've grown into having 2 amazing hospices, and also the care that we give out in the community as well. Over time, and also with the numbers of volunteers growing, back in the day, volunteers were doing a little bit of everything and there wasn't that structure within the programme, but now within our volunteer programme it's very structured. Every volunteer has a role, a specific role, they have a role description, boundaries, and the support what support that they can get within their role and who that comes from, so they know who their go-to person is, that it's a set time each week for the minimum of 1 year. But our volunteers have been with us for 30 years. We have many volunteers who've been here 25 years plus, and they're just a wonderful bunch. Like they're absolutely amazing, and to spend time talking to them and to learn more about why they got involved, their stories are just wonderful. They really are, and they bring so much to the hospice. Somebody mentioned the other day, they were talking about, the blocks, say, building a wall, and you have all these building blocks, and then you have the cement that's put in between, and that was the way in which they described our volunteers, that they're that glue that holds everything together. Their enhancement makes such a difference to our patients and their families, and we're just so appreciative of what they do. They're just wonderful.
Pat Breslin is known as the very first volunteer with St Francis Hospice. She is long retired now, but recalls her very first experience with the organisation. So I suppose we're looking at one of the pictures there.
That's the porter cabin.
What do you remember? Do you remember when that went in?
Yes, I do.
How did you start? How did you become a volunteer?
That's a good question. I was working for the Capuchins. I was doing coffee mornings, and the money was all going to the missions. And so anyway, that started, and then this turned up, what was coming.
And what did you think about the idea of a hospice?
Oh, I thought it was brilliant. The day we turned the sod, but all the government were there, the whole lot of them. And the rain came down in bucketfuls. And anyway, they had said to me, will you do the food? And I said, well, I'll try. So anyway, I went round, and I've got all my friends that helped me with the missions. And I said, will you do something for the hospice, you see? And they all, of course, said yes. And then, anyway, that's how I got it all together.
So I'm Alison Barker, and my current role is reception team lead at St Francis Hospice Dublin. So I look after the reception teams in Raheny and Blanchardstown Hospice.
When did you start here?
I started in 1997, I came from the Marriage Guidance Council, worked with Accord for many years, and then I came here.
The reception is the front line to the world. You know, reception's not easy anywhere, but it's got extra challenges here.
You really don't know what's going to come in the door next. You can be faced with anything, and you know, to me, that's a privilege to work there and to be that, you know, that the first contact, sometimes by telephone or face to face. That when I think about our values as well, one of my own personal strongest values is kindness, and my personal motto is kindness is what matters most. And if you have people coming in, no matter, you don't know what they're going to say to you, if you are there welcoming and present to them. Being present to somebody is so, so important. And it may be, you know, maybe to make a donation, it may be to come in and see they're walking through the door for the first time, maybe their mother or their father or their son or their daughter has been admitted. So our care of them is really, really important. How they feel when they walk out that, oh, okay, that was okay. It wasn't as... So many people say, you know, oh, this is not what I was expecting. And I'm very proud of all the team that I work with, because we are committed to that care of people as they walk in the door and to help them in whatever way we can. Historically, we had 3 values in St Francis Hospice: dignity, respect and compassion. And they sort of evolved as the organisation grew. And over the years, from early on, I was involved in a values programme. Some of us were trained by the Daughters of Charity, and we delivered programmes about ethos and values. In the last number of years, we've revisited the values, and we now have 6 values. So we have added on, we held on to dignity, respect and compassion because they were very close to our hearts. And we have added on excellence, kindness and collaboration. And those values came from the staff. So work was done with the staff to ask them, what do you think are the most important values? So it's okay, sometimes values can be a little bit up in the air, you know, or there's something that you aspire to, but you don't, you know. What does kindness look like? What does compassion look like? In my early days in Raheny here, my office was above the inpatient unit and overlooking the garden. We were like in an attic. I remember hearing laughter on one sunny afternoon, and I looked out the window, and one of our patients was out there in his bed, and his friends were sitting around him. And there was just great joy coming from there. And I remember saying to one of the doctors here, oh, that was just so lovely to hear and see. And she said, you know, we didn't have a wheelchair that was comfortable for that patient. So we just opened the doors and we pushed out the bed. And to me, that defined palliative care. Obviously, there are times that are very difficult. And, you know, often I get asked, how do you work in a hospice? It must be very difficult. But as I said earlier, for me, the primary thing is that I feel it's a privilege. I think the most difficult thing that we find, and as a mother myself, and obviously when my children were small, and as a young mother, seeing young mothers as patients can be very, very difficult. Seeing children coming in, you know, and again, you get to know people. There's specific patients that you remember over the years, and you remember the children that come in, and I often think about how they're doing now. Or there's one little girl, her mum was with us in Blanchardstown, and she used to come up to the desk when she came in with her dad. She'd have the chats about all her news when she'd come in, and she had just this little tiny little toy, it's a little Smurf. And she said, put that on your desk. I want you to have that on your desk. And I said, but that's yours. No, put it there. So we put it there, and we still have it on the desk. And I suppose it's a reminder for me, when I look at that, that's a reminder of the importance of that care. And, you know, of how comfortable she felt coming in, and that we like to have the chat with her. So it's about building those relationships, but that you have to be aware of, you know, what your triggers are, or if something happens for you. I always say to people, don't go home with it. If something has happened that you find upsetting, talk to one of your colleagues about it, because you never know when your own grief might just come to the surface. One of the great things about St Francis Hospice is that all our services are free. And it's such a joy to be able to tell people that when they are, you know, I've had people ask the questions about the service and go, okay, now, last question is, how much does it cost? And for me to be able to say it's absolutely free is just wonderful.
My name is Anna Kennedy. I'm a sister, and my role is a chaplain in St Francis Hospice. And I work mostly with community palliative care. Because a person is a holistic person, it's not just the physical pain, you have the physical, the psychological, the emotional, the social and the spiritual. Now, because I'm a chaplain, I'm concentrating on the spiritual. What the spiritual means for the person differs and an awful lot today than, say, 20 years ago. Before we spoke about spiritual, it was very much about, I suppose, religion and having a practice and a faith belief and how does that faith support me. Today, when you're checking with somebody about what is spiritually important to you, it could involve a religious aspect, it may not involve a religious aspect. For some people, they might say their family is what is spiritually important for them, and isn't that absolutely beautiful? Others might talk about nature, or about sports, or about even what they do in life. So it's very much about checking in what is spiritually important for the individual, and beginning where they are at. You know, I don't go in with a plan that I'm going to say and do this. Because I suppose I'm a Catholic and I believe in a God who loves me, and I'd always ask that God to support me in the day. But I don't go in with a plan, I go in and I be. And I think that's the most important thing for anyone, is someone to be truly present to them at a given time. We will go where the need is, where the person who needs us, regardless of where that is. You know, prisons, if that's necessary, direct provisions, which I have visited, any place the person that needs care. There is no place out of bound. There is no condition out of bound. What I mean by that, it doesn't matter what kind of an area that people will talk about, we will still go in there, you know. And of course, I suppose the safety of our staff is always in view, but I have never felt in any risk or danger, no matter where I've gone, you know. But and it is important that all people have access to palliative care, no matter where they live or what their past history is. It doesn't matter one bit. They are a human being with dignity and deserves the best of respect and care from everyone and anyone.
So my name's Barbara Sweeney and I work as a lecturer tutor in the education department. I'm a nurse as well. I've worked in palliative care for 21 years. So I would have worked in the Sacred Heart Hospice in Sydney in Australia, and then I came home and I was a nurse in the inpatient unit here for a number of years, and then I moved to daycare for a year, and then I worked as a clinical nurse specialist in the community for a long time, and I moved into education in 2011. It's funny, I always knew I was going to work in palliative care. Like even for my finals when I was studying nursing, which is going back, my finals were in 1996, my final thesis was on palliative care and complementary therapies. So it was always somewhere I was going that I was interested in. One of my best friends, when we were 17, her dad died in Harold's Cross. So I would have gone through a number of years with her of her dad being sick, and I remember hearing the stories of the staff and the care that her dad got and how much it helped the family, and it always stayed with me. So when nursing, it just came for me that that's what I'd like to do.
Part of your role here is outreach into the community. When did that start?
That came from the secondary school I went to was 100 years old, and I was at the anniversary. There was a big for all past pupils. I went to it and I met one of the teachers, and she was asking me what I was doing, and I told her I worked here, and she said, would you please come and talk to the students, the transition year students, about nursing as a career? And I said, no problem. So I went to talk to the students. They were very interested in the palliative care part, and they had a lot of questions, and it just got me thinking. I came back and I talked to the team, and I thought, you know, these are our patients in the future, some of them, or family members, and they really had no understanding of palliative care. And I also, from working in the community, sometimes I did the first visit, so I'd be the first person people would meet from St Francis, and time again I heard patients saying, God, if I knew this is what it was like, I would have accessed your services sooner. But people were afraid to access our services because they thought that all we talk about is death and dying, whereas we're very much focused on quality of life, symptom management, psychological care, spiritual care, and sometimes talking about death and dying, but that's up to the patient, very much so, and family, the individual. Yeah, so I think between those two things, it just struck me that we need to do more in the community, and a way to do it would be through schools. So I spoke to the team about it. We had a meeting and we said, the head of education he could really see the value of it. So we wrote out and Donna was a great help contacting all the schools. I really saw the benefit of it. I did a pre kind of questionnaire and then a post questionnaire after the talk, and really it's just an education talk about palliative care, about the hospice, about research that came out in relation to individuals who've life-limiting conditions who access palliative care services. Not only is their quality of life better, but they're living longer. And people are afraid to access their services. So I really wanted to get that message out. I also showed pictures of what it looked like, because people can be very afraid of the building even itself. So, like I used to say to the students, what does this building look like? And they're like, it looks like a hotel. And I said, yeah, it does. It's a really nice building. And, there's pictures of, teddies across couches and a playroom for children. And they really felt it, and it didn't look like a hospital. And it's designed like that, to try and be like a home, from home, I suppose, as much as possible. Even though most of our care is in the community, we still, there are some complex cases that need to come in sometimes.
What questions did you get asked the most?
The question I actually got asked most was, how did I do it? How did I work here? How did I work with people who were terminally ill, who had life-limiting conditions? Was it not too sad? Did I cry at work? All these questions, and I was always very open. Answering those questions.
How do you answer those questions? What did you say?
Well, I could only answer personally from my experience, and I've always been able to work in palliative care, and sometimes it's been hard over the years, but I've always been able to do it because I got to make a difference, and that was always how I was able to manage it. I also found ways of and I had to find ways of self-care working in this area, and I learned that after a few years, that in order to be able to continue this work, I had to mind myself, and that's something that's really strong in our ethos here at St Francis.
So my name is Margaret Winters, and I'm a clinical nurse manager here in St Francis Hospice in Raheny, and I manage the day service.
When did you start?
I started way back in January 1998. Yes, I've had my 30th, 40th and 50th birthday working here in the hospice. So I've been here quite a while. So I started working in the inpatient unit, came as a youngish staff nurse there, and worked there for about 18 months, and then discovered the joy of daycare and got the opportunity to move to daycare. And I've been here ever since and really love it. I think it's the best job in the house, really. You get the interaction with the patients, you have, the whole experience of working with them, and you get to know them over a period of time, which is lovely.
Are they apprehensive at all? Like, what kind of experience do you have with patients coming in?
It can be very varied, really, and that's probably something that hasn't changed people's understanding of palliative care, despite the work that's done in the publicity in Palliative Care Week, and people are talking about it more. Often when people hear hospice, they are very frightened, they're worried about it. For example, if I'm out and somebody asks me where I work, I'll say I'm a nurse. I never say I'm a hospice nurse. And I suppose I've learned over time, one, it can make people feel very uncomfortable, or the other way, it can be, oh my goodness, you're amazing, that's wonderful, you're such an angel, I don't know how you do it. And you don't want either reaction, really. So it's only over time they gradually sort of realise where you work and what you do, and then it can be sort of, oh, really? Okay, right. So it can be a bit of a social conversation stopper. But yeah, people can be fearful when they hear hospice. They think that's it, that's the end. But palliative care has changed so much. It's about a layer of support when people are facing a life-limiting illness. And what's been wonderful to see over the years is that we've become involved with people much earlier in their illness. So you can meet somebody maybe after diagnosis or when the situation has become palliative, where cure is no longer an option, unfortunately. And then with the support of the multidisciplinary team, we can help somebody to improve their quality of life, to improve their symptom management, that maybe they have a short interaction with the hospice service and go away again and live their life. Maybe in 6 months or a year's time they come back to us again. So it's more an in and out of the service as people need. So the service is very much needs-led, what the person needs to live their life, the best quality of life they can have. Now some people we do meet when they are further on in their illness, and our involvement would be more structured. They may come to our daycare, they may be seen at home by the community palliative care team, or they may come into our inpatient unit. And the beauty of working in daycare is that you get to know people over a period of time, so they get to know you at their own pace. Coming into daycare, it's very non-clinical. We don't wear uniforms. It's a very homely atmosphere, and that's deliberate. So it's a very gentle introduction to the hospice service. It's non-threatening. People can decide if they'd like to come in or not. Families can come with them on the first day. We very much go at their pace, so we are led by what they want to talk about. Now, we have a structure in our head looking at symptom management, future care planning, what support is there, what resources we can liaise with or organise for people. So all that's going on in the background. But it's a very relaxed interaction that we're supporting people along their journey.
What's a typical day like in daycare?
Typical day, patients come in around 10 o'clock-ish. There's always a cup of tea and a warm welcome. We're supported by a team of over 70 volunteers, and we really couldn't manage the service without our volunteers. So from a staff perspective, we're very much clinically focused. So we're looking at symptom management, future care planning, organising services. But the experience of daycare is a joint initiative, I suppose, between the staff and the volunteers, what makes daycare, the magic of daycare. So the clinical side is very much going on, but the volunteers provide the layers of support, the social interaction. So when somebody is facing a life-limiting illness, it's not just about the diagnosis or the hospital appointments or the medication or the scans or all the interactions with medics. It's about, you're still the same person. You may have, had to give up work. You may not be able to go out and kick a football with the kids or bring them swimming or, do all the things you would have done. So the whole idea of the person, that can be lost with the illness. So there's a huge amount of thought and work about finding meaning. What does this illness mean for you? It's not that the illness is the end of everything. Your health is changing, but you're still very much a person. You're still, you could still be a mom or a sister or a granny or a sibling. You still have your role in that, and the illness doesn't rob that from you, although you may feel it does, because your energy may be gone. You may have lost your hair, your body, you may have gained weight, you may have lost weight, your moods might be different. Everything is different. But this has become the norm now. This is your life. So it's about giving something back. So it could be coming into daycare. You're meeting other people in similar situations. Some people talk about their illness. Some people never talk about their illness, and that's absolutely fine. Nobody's expected to do anything when they're here. You don't have to behave in a certain way. You don't have to be all singing, all dancing. If you want to sit in the corner and read the paper, that's absolutely fine. It's no problem. So they come in, they have a cup of tea, a warm welcome. Then the day is scheduled, so one of the nurses will link in with each person to do a full assessment, which is done in a very informal way. So we're checking in again with symptoms, any worries, any concerns, what's going on. We'd link in with the family as well. How are they coping? How are they managing? Anything they're worried about. Then our volunteers are here, so they would organise, there's an art class, there's hand care, there's complementary therapies with some staff and volunteers, we have a gardener, we have our drivers, dog visitors, there's a hot meal. The hairdressers here is always very popular with men and the women as well. There's mass, which is completely optional. Some people are talking to God, some people aren't, and that's absolutely fine. In the afternoon then people tend to be a bit more tired, so there's some comfortable chairs if people want to rest. There could be some music, there could be a quiz. So the social side of it, because people aren't interacting socially the way they may have been in the past because they don't have the same level of energy. And during the day the nurses are coming and going and meeting people. to do the assessment. So there could be up to 16 people that are here per day. We'd refer then on to our colleagues. We'd link in with the public health nurse, their GP, community physiotherapist, occupational therapist. On staff here as well, we have social worker, chaplaincy. So there's somebody within the team that can meet the need once we identify the need. And over time, as people come usually once a week, we get to know them and what the needs are. So it may be when people are here for a couple of weeks, then you sort of realise, I didn't know that was going on, maybe we can help with this. So you're also preparing for the future as well. So you're checking with somebody, in the future, if you're less well, how do you think you might manage? Where do you think you'd like to be? So while daycare is very much about life and living, you're still acknowledging serious illness and what's ahead. And you do that at a pace that's right for the person. So by asking opening questions like that, in the future, if you're less well, how do you see things going? You're giving them the opportunity to say, well, I really don't want to talk about that, or actually I'd like this, this and this. So you're starting a conversation. You don't have to have it all sorted out and organised, but it's just starting that conversation with the person, with the family. So over the years, I suppose, as I've gotten older, there are patients that maybe I've connected with. We may have had children the same age, or I remember one lady, we were both looking for communion dresses at the same time. And while it was lovely to share that with her, she shared that with me, and I felt comfortable enough to share that with her, that connection was there to build the bond. I'm the professional, she's the patient, but we connected as two mothers doing the same thing. And for that, I suppose, how do you manage that? It's really how I would look at it personally is, unfortunately people I would meet here, their story is not going to change whether I'm involved in their care or not. Unfortunately, they have a life-limiting illness that at some stage they will die from. So whether I'm involved with their story or not, the outcome is going to be the same, unfortunately. So for me, it's looking at what difference can I make to them. I know I'm not going to be able to cure them, unfortunately, but what difference can I make to their quality of life? Now, it may be sorting out some medication to improve a symptom. It may be having a conversation about communion dresses that makes them feel, I suppose, affirms their role in some way. But their story is their story. It's not my story. It's not my grief. It's not my... you make the connection, but I don't take it on because it's not my story. Now, some people do stay with you and will always stay with you for whatever reason. There are particularly sad things that happen. I know after bereavement myself, I found it difficult, a patient with similar circumstances, and that's where my team came in and said, look, I'm going to look after this man today. I'm going to give it, you need a break. And sometimes I think as nurses, you don't think of that because you put the person first, you put that connection first. So it's lovely to have a supportive colleague to say, okay, another day, not today. And that's where self-awareness and self-care very much comes into this role, to know what am I able for today. And it doesn't mean you can't do the job, it just means, well, today I need to do it slightly differently, or someone else needs to step in. And then, the joy of the team is that the support is there, that I know I can step in for another colleague if I see they're struggling with something, or if there's an issue that we can, why are we finding this particularly difficult or challenging? And you need that support working in palliative care to keep going in palliative care. And that comes back to the conversation when you tell people actually what you do, it's about death and dying, and oh my God, how do you do this? But I love my job. I really love my job. And that sounds bizarre, but you get to make a difference every day to people. And it could be just something very, very small, knowing something about them, or it could be something major where you're facilitating a difficult conversation, or you're supporting them in breaking bad news, or you're planning ahead for the future. Like I might think, if this was me in their position, what would I find helpful? And I'm very practical, so I'd want practical things. So in the past, maybe with young mothers, I would have helped them, and with the team as well, looking at maybe doing some memory work, or I know when my kids were small, I always thought, God, if something happened to me, my husband would never know how to buy a uniform, when to get their shoes changed, all the practical things. So there was one lady, similar time, we actually did a monthly calendar. So each month, this is what you need to do each month. So you need to start planning for Santi in September, October. You need to start planning for Halloween, all these things. And it was difficult, and there were tears shed, but I know that put our mind at rest for that. And that's huge, for people. Now, you do have sad days, and you do have days where you need the hot cup of tea and you need the chocolate, and there's always chocolate in the fridge here. But self-care and palliative care is really, really important.
Well, my name's Anne Brennan, and I'm a staff nurse here in the inpatient unit of St Francis Hospice in Raheny. Yeah.
When did you join?
So I started in January the 1st, 2007. So I'm just over 13 years. Yeah, it doesn't feel like 13 years. It feels much shorter. And I came from Beaumont, and it was an acute care setting, so I worked in general ICU and neuro ICU, so I suppose we did have death and dying, but it was in an acute area rather than this where there's so much holding. And it was more that I was comfortable with just being present with people as they were dying, and maybe being with their families and sitting with them at the deathbed. So I knew the minute I arrived and came through the door, and I was so well received. It was like the interview was just lovely. It was, you could feel the respect for the work you did, the previous work that I, respect as a human being, and you could feel that standard. The quality of work that they did just by coming through the door. I could feel it. I had dealt with lots of death, lots of communication, but it was always with family and not with the person doing the journey. So I had a concern about that because I hadn't experience and skills in that area, and so that definitely was my concern when a patient would ask me, "Am I dying?" or what is happening, and how to turn and face it with truth and integrity. How are you feeling? Why do you ask that question? They say, "Oh, because I feel weaker." And you go, "Yes, you appear weaker." And then you can proceed on and talk about their disease and the fact that it's not being actively treated. So then you can talk about what we are doing, supporting someone's symptoms and supporting them and their family while they face into their death and the process of dying, and then offer them a chance to talk about that process if that's what they would wish. And some people just quickly revert back and pull back. They mightn't want anymore. And it's interesting, they might just ask one person and not another, and I think the relationship that we build with patients is so important, so that they're comfortable enough to ask the questions they need to ask.
My name is Mary Condon, and at the moment I'm the ward manager in the inpatient unit here in Raheny. I started here on the 1st of May 1996, which is a long time ago. When I came here first, the unit would mainly have been for patients with end-stage cancer. Now, some would have come in for, I suppose, symptom control and then go home again, but the majority would have been for end-stage cancer, for terminal care within the hospice setting. An occasional patient with HIV, which would have been more prevalent at that stage, but now with the triple therapy treatment, very few patients have end-stage needs of palliative care. Whereas now, I suppose, with the strategic planning for palliative care over the last 10 years or so, we would have end-stage renal failure, end-stage cardiac failure. Like, for example, we're getting an end-stage cardiac failure in this afternoon, and that's wonderful. End-stage respiratory problems. I suppose it's defining what end-stage is. That's the biggest crux, particularly when you go outside the peripheries of cancer and motor neuron as well. There are so many new, even for cancer, there's so many new treatments to prolong life. So I suppose it's at a kind of I would say, a very much an in-between stage, because you can end up with patients who can be here for a long time.
How long? What's the longest time a patient's been in here?
Well, we discharged somebody last year. Is he gone? Yes, last year. And he came back and walked through the door here last Friday, and he was here for over a year.
Wow.
So he was quite sick when he came, and it looked like he was going to be here a very short time. He was a young man in his 20s, and now he's out and about. So it's a very fine line sometimes, now most of the times, but for end-stage cardiac and respiratory, they can be end-stage for a long time. So it's getting the balance of when somebody needs specialist palliative care as opposed to long-term care in a long-stay facility. It's getting that fine balance, because otherwise we won't have beds for people with specialist palliative care needs.
Can you tell when someone is dying?
Usually, yes. Like immediately dying, as in, say, just very short hours? Usually, yes, because all the symptoms are there. But, having said that, we had a lady last week who, I was here on the Monday, and I said, and I was off on Tuesday. I said, she'd definitely be gone on Wednesday. That lady lived until Sunday. So sometimes nature can defy the odds, but for us it's really just so long as we can keep them really comfortable. And I really firmly believe that there's kind of a reason behind all these things, whether it's to give the family time or it's just not the time for the person to go. The whole team works very closely together. So if I'm strong, say, in giving emotional support to a patient, somebody else may be very good at giving the whole physical. So it's blending the whole team together that you manage to give a really good package of care, but not alone to the patient, to the extended family and significant others as well. So it's really being able to care for every aspect of the patient. It's easy to do the physical side of it, but it's been able to tease out the emotional needs that are there for a person. And it's only with giving somebody time and space that it will come out in conversation, but it's not something that can be rushed. So I really feel the essence of palliative care is all about the quality time we spend with the patient, with the significant others that are involved in that person's life. I suppose the whole thing of palliative care, you have to be quite balanced in yourself, because on average we could have maybe 22, 23 deaths every month. So it's important that we are a professional person first and foremost, while being able to care for the person at a very intimate level and a very personal level. But it's still not my family. I take on the responsibility of giving 100% while I'm here, but then I know that my boundaries are that I don't take that away with me. And I suppose in palliative care, because you work so closely as a team, you're able to, I'm able to, and if a person, I am, as a manager, if somebody wasn't, I would be hopefully to help them to look at their boundaries and to look at their own personal well-being. Because if you were to give yourself and take it away with you, be thinking about it while you're out of here, you'd burn out within 6 months. To have good, healthy outlets outside of the hospice and not to carry, I suppose, the emotional pain that's here away with me, because if I do, then I'd be no good to anybody.
What kind of things have happened over the years? Because I hear stories of weddings have happened and christenings, and
even as recent, we've had lots of weddings. Now most of them you'd be able to fairly well plan for them, but as recent as last Tuesday, we had a gentleman that was admitted on the Monday, and before coming it was planned that his wedding would be on the Thursday here in the hospice. But on Tuesday morning, he looked like Thursday was a year away almost. So his condition deteriorated. So we asked him, did he still want to go ahead with the wedding? And he said yes, but was there anything that could be done to bring it forward? So the registrar was contacted. She was brilliant, and she came in 3:30 Tuesday afternoon, and the wedding happened quietly with just his family, his 2 sons, his wife, the witnesses in the room, and it happened in his own bed in the bedroom, which was so important. We put some flowers in, some candles, make it possible with what you have within a limited time.
Okay, hi, my name is Niamh Finucane and I'm Coordinator of Social Work and Bereavement Services. Part of palliative care is that the patient and the family are the unit of care, but for the social work role we do a lot of work with families, because we also know that if we can help somebody understand more about what's going on and be more prepared for it, we know they're going to do better afterwards. And better afterwards doesn't mean they won't be sad or upset or really grieve and miss the person, but it's how they might do that. And even when we've done that well, or other people have done that well, there's still a group of people who are going to need a lot of extra support. But most people need good quality information on how they might cope, because grief is a language that people maybe have never heard before. They understand tears and upset, they expect in the immediate aftermath of a death, but they don't know what to expect after that. So sometimes there's a big role for us to educate somebody around the different ways that grief can show up in our world. You know, the things that are happening, like the poor memory, the lack of concentration, the sleep being disrupted, the routines being, maybe at odds with what they used to be, all the transitions they have to make. So we have a big role, I think, in helping people understand more about what's going on and what, for want of a better term, normal grief might look like, because it feels far from normal. And people, feel very much at sea. And I think in the modern world, they don't often have the same social networks or family networks that they used to have. And I also think both during illness and in bereavement, it brings family to the fore. Whether you have one, whether you don't have one, whether they're close, whether there's tensions, and it's definitely exacerbated all through somebody's illness.
What kind of questions do you get asked the most?
Because I think beforehand, it depends, sometimes we've people wondering how the next while is going to look, how they manage it. Sometimes they can't understand how they're going to deal with somebody dying, and what's that going to look like. A lot of people, particularly the relatives, are saying, I don't know how I'm going to live without them, because they've never imagined a future without them, or just it's so different to now that they can't see it. So lots of times it's working with people around their own resources and what they can do and how they are managing, and helping them to say a proper goodbye. And sometimes that opportunity comes very naturally, other times they need help and assistance to do that, either because of their own fears or worries, or that of the patient, or maybe because, there's other blocks in the way. And so it's helping them find ways to do all of that. And in bereavement, we get a lot of questions about, is this normal? Is it normal that actually I don't want to go out and see people anymore? Is it normal that I just don't feel like I'm coping very well and my head's all over the place? I think the information provision is so important, particularly for relatives. When somebody is sick, very often they think that their own needs become secondary. And so sometimes you're trying to help carers begin to think about how do they mind themselves so that they can be resourced enough to mind the other person. And if they're doing it at their own cost, how's that going to work out? And there is definitely physical aspects to loss. It does affect how we eat, how we sleep. It does affect us because we might get aches and pains in different parts of our bodies. And it's the physical manifestation of the hurt and the grief and the loss that's happening, because all through somebody's illness, there's different losses that are occurring, as well as the final loss of death, and then the secondary losses that are happening and all the transitions they have to make into what will become their new life, and their new way of being in the world again.
How long do families stay in touch after their loved one has died?
It varies hugely. So we provide a standardised service, which means that every family should get contact from the hospice, and we will send an invite out to a service of remembrance a few weeks later, and a few months after that to a bereavement information evening. So people may or may not take up those invites. After that, they might ring us in and look for support. So sometimes it's months later before somebody comes back to us and they got the invites but they weren't able to think about it at the time or didn't feel in the place. Sometimes it's after the first anniversary or the second Christmas. because sometimes people think to grieve and to move on, means forgetting the person, whereas we very much are encouraging that continuing bond. Death ends a life, but not a relationship.
And you yourself, how do you deal with all of the sadness? It sounds like a very challenging job.
Well, it can be, and sometimes you're sitting with somebody in such intense emotion, and it can be very powerful in the room. But it's funny because I often think if you were to sit outside one of the doors and be looking in, you might see absolute distress, and then a while later you might hear laughter. And it could ebb and flow through a session like that. I think you have to really hold what your role is, because if you get into that grief with somebody and you begin to, stay there, you're not going to be helpful to them. Whereas we have to be very clear that our role is about helping them navigate it. So we need to be mindful of that. I mean, our clinical supervision is what would help us deal with some of it. The support of the team, supporting each other in social work, and then the broader hospice team, and then also our own self-care, because there will be people, no matter what, that will just touch on something on you, and whether it's a loss you've had yourself or it's just mindful of somebody in your own life, because I think one of the things palliative care has done for me is certainly make me have a different perspective and make me think about things. But I remember in the early days where I used to say, oh my goodness, I can't wait to get home to hug my children. And then I'd get home and 10 minutes later I'm looking at myself thinking, but you're still giving out to them. And so it's the reality of life as well, and it's keeping those two things together.
My name is Valerie Vetter and you've been listening to Hospice Women. I'd like to take a moment to thank Dublin City FM and BAI for their vital role in supporting programmes like this. And I'd also very much like to thank the many incredible people who made this documentary possible and shared their story. Sister Bernadette McMahon, Martina O'Dowd, Betty McDonnell, Barbara Kilbride, Pat Breslin, Alison Barker, Barbara Sweeney, Sister Anna Kennedy, Margaret Winters, Anne Brennan, Mary Condon and Niamh Finucane. Plus many thanks to others within St Francis Hospice who are so important to this being made, including Donna Reddy, Education and Publications Officer, and CEO Fintan Fagan. I have so much respect for all the dedicated people who come together each day to support patients and their families to live the best quality of life they can. Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with a television licence fee.